This is obviously an issue that is very dear and personal to many of you, and it's obviously an issue that you and many other Australians are in fact very passionate about. As you would all know, the Australian Labor Party is totally opposed to the death penalty, and I too strongly hold the personal belief that the death penalty as a punishment is a terrible mistake. It is not an effective deterrent to crime, and it is not a just penalty to take someone's life for a crime. Opposition to the death penalty is a long-standing official line of successive Australian governments and the Australian people. In Australia, the death penalty has been abolished for all federal crimes, no matter how grievous, since 1973. It has been abolished at all levels of state and territory government since 1985. In more than 40 years since the death penalty has been used in Australia, when Ryan became the last man to be executed in Australia. Australia, of course, is a party to the UN International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and, as you've heard from Lee Rush, the optional protocol of that convention on the abolition of the death penalty. The debate in Australia, including around the Law Reform Commission's recent publication, Same Time, Same Crime, Sentencing of Federal Offenders, has been how best to show our opposition to the death penalty, not whether or not it exists. So there is no doubt in my mind that Australia is opposed to the death penalty. Slowly, the world seems to be coming around this point of view. In 2005, Amnesty International reported that more than half the countries in the world had abolished the death penalty in law or in practice. Amnesty International have also reported that in the last 3 years alone, Mexico, Liberia, the Philippines and Albania have abolished the death penalty for all crimes. And I commend all countries which have recently taken the decision or are coming to the view that the death penalty is grossly unsuitable penalty in the modern world and should be treated as such. We are slowly getting there. Unfortunately, for a number of young Australians who have dominated the news in recent years, Indonesia is not one of those countries which have abolished the death penalty. But let me personalise this evening. The members of the so-called Bali Nine did make a terrible mistake. And it cannot be denied that drugs are a scourge to the community and do cause untold harm to many people and to many families. And I think you will agree that individuals such as those should not be punished strongly. Should be punished, I should say, strongly for their actions. But they should not pay with their lives. And I think it's time for any state calling itself a modern democracy to do away with the death penalty once and for all. The argument against the death penalty must be made with conviction, and it must be made from the unassailable position of moral superiority. It is important to note at this point that it's not just from a position of moral outrage that we criticise the death penalty. There is strong argument that the death penalty violates the most fundamental of our human rights. The publication of the Australian Law Reform Commission titled Same Crime, Same Time, Sentencing of Federal Offenders, which I mentioned earlier, looked briefly at the issue of capital punishment and concluded that it potentially violated two fundamental principles of International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. Those were, of course, the right to life and the right not to be subject to cruel, inhuman or degrading punishment. The report described the death penalty as an invidious practice and stated that it had no place in an enlightened regime in the sentencing of offenders. So given Australia's professed position on the death penalty, perhaps it is time, as a nation, we showed leadership by raising this issue in international forums as a moral imperative. Our friends like Singapore, the USA and Japan, China and Indonesia need to know clearly and unambiguously what we think about the use of the death penalty and must be asked to
show leadership and reform. We should not be hedging our bets on this. No matter what crime their children have committed, no parent should be punished by the execution of their child. It is fundamentally unjust. Finally, there are 2 points that I wish to conclude on. Firstly, if I can say, the so-called Bali Nine case does hold some critically important lessons for all Australians, and particularly young Australians travelling overseas. That is, don't get involved with drugs. Full stop. It puts you at risk of a downward spiral with all the devastating consequences of addiction, poor health and criminality. And when you are in another country, be aware of their laws and obey them. In some countries, of course, you can be flogged for having alcohol, while in other countries you can be executed for committing adultery. If you're travelling overseas, you should familiarise yourself with those laws through consulates, through foreign affairs travel advisories, and among other sources that are available, such as guides and the web. Don't rely on second and third-hand information. Not every overseas country is like Australia, with its strong protection for human rights and strong protection for the accused person. If you don't like the law of a foreign country, lodge a protest by not going there and not spending your money there, quite frankly. The second point I'd like to conclude on is to make you aware of Labor's proposal for a dialogue on the protection of human rights in Australia. If a Rudd Labor government is elected later this year, the Labor Party's national platform commits the party to establishing a public inquiry that would investigate the protection of human rights in Australia. What rights should be protected and how best to protect them. Labor will establish a panel of eminent Australians to hold public inquiries across the country to seek the input of all Australians on this important issue. If Labor wins the federal election at the end of this year, I would urge all of you to become involved in this process, as I'm sure many of you, and in fact most of you, all of you will. I'll conclude by again wishing you every success, the organisers, in your political activism and the people here tonight against the death penalty abroad, and also in your endeavours to bring about the commutation of the sentences